The great hall of High March burned with 1,000 candles, and every one of them seemed to lean toward the Alpha King as he danced. Emeric of Dunmere danced the way he did everything, with a still kind of power that made the room arrange itself around him. He had not wanted this gathering. Half the noble houses of the realm had come to the midwinter concord to smile at one another over old grievances, and a king was expected to open the floor. So he opened it, one measure with the daughter of a border lord, his face polite and far away, his mind on the reports folded inside his coat. He did not see the man near the musician slide a hand beneath his cloak. He did not see the thin bright thing catch the candlelight, but she did. She came out of the crowd as though she had been poured from it, a woman in deep gray that no one could afterward say they had noticed arriving. She stepped between the king and his partner, as if the dance had always been meant to pass to her, and the border lord's daughter, too startled to argue with a stranger's certainty, gave way. Before Emeric could speak, the woman set one hand at his shoulder and folded the other into his, and she leaned close enough that her breath moved against his ear. "Pretend I am your Luna," she said, "and keep dancing." He went rigid. Every wolf in him rose at once, at the nearness of her, at the sheer nerve of it. He almost stopped. Her hand tightened on his. "If you stop," she murmured, "you die in front of 600 people. So, smile your grace, and turn me to the left." Something in the flat calm of her voice reached him before his pride could answer. He turned her to the left. The turn carried them 3 steps off the line they had been walking, and behind them, in the place his back had filled a breath before, a servant lurched into the empty space with his arm already rising. The blade in his fist found nothing but air and the shoulder of another guest, who yelped and spun, and the moment tangled into confusion instead of murder. She did not look back. She kept the king moving, guiding him through the pattern of the dance, with a strength that did not match her slender frame, past a pillar, past the cold draft of a side door, past a second man who had been drifting toward them, and now hesitated, his chance gone. "Keep smiling," she breathed. "There is one more by the far arch. Laugh, as though I have said something charming." Emeric, Altha, King of Dunmere, who had not been told what to do by any living soul since he was a boy, laughed. It came out rough and startled and real, and the sound of it turned heads for an entirely different reason. To the whole glittering hall, it looked like nothing but what she had told him to make it look like. A king and a woman in gray, wrapped up in one another, dancing as though the rest of the world had gone dim. The music ended. In the sudden hush he caught her wrist before she could melt away, and he held it, and he looked at her for the first time. Gray eyes, steady as river stone, a face he had never seen at any court in his life. And beneath the perfume of the candles and the crush of bodies, no scent on her at all, none, which was not possible, which no breathing thing had ever been. "Guards!" someone shouted from across the hall. "Guards, seize her!" She rushed the king. The cry went up, before anyone understood the truth of it. Steel scraped from a dozen sheets. Men in the king's own colors closed from 3 sides at once, hands hard on her arms, wrenching her back and down, and the hall that had just watched her save his life now watched them drag her to the floor as the very thing that had come to end it. And Emeric, who had no idea what she had done, who felt only the cooling ghost of her touch on his wrist, and the strange hollow where her scent should have been, said nothing, and let them take her. They put her in a cold room beneath the hall, and they sent for the king's chancellor before they thought to send for the king. Lord Doran came down the stair without hurry. He was a lean, gray, courteous man who had served the crown of Dunmere through 2 reigns, and he had a way of seeming sorry for whatever he was about to do. He studied the woman in gray where she sat, unbound now, but ringed by guards, her hands folded in her lap as though she waited for tea. "You put a killing fright into a room full of the realm's great houses," he said. "You laid hands on the king before 600 witnesses. Give me your name and your house, and perhaps this ends with exile rather than a rope." She said nothing for a long moment. "A servant tried to open your king's throat tonight," she said at last, "and you have come down here to ask me for a name." She let it settle in the cold air. "Ask yourself instead, who dressed that servant in the king's own colors? Who let a stranger with a blade stand near enough to try? Who gains, my lord, if Emeric of Dunmere does not live to see the spring?" Doran's courteous face did not change, but something behind his eyes went briefly, perfectly still, and she marked it, and gave no sign that she had. The door opened and the king came in, and the small room seemed to shrink around him. He did not sit. He looked at her the way a wolf looks at a thing it cannot name, and the not naming of it troubled him more than the knife had. "Leave us," he said, and the guards went, and Doran went last of all, slow and listening, until the door took him too. "You saved my life," Emeric said, when they were alone. "You saved it. And then you let my own men take you down for it, and you have not once asked me to spare you." He came a step closer. "Why?" "Because if I had named what I saw in that hall," she answered, "the ones who arranged it would know they had been seen, and they would only try again, cleaner and quieter, until they did not miss. Better they believe a madwoman rushed you and failed. Better they grow bold. Bold men leave marks." He was quiet a moment. "And your name?" he said. "I have no name to give you," she said, "not one that would keep either of us breathing." He should have called the guards back in. Any king with sense would have. Instead, he found that he believed her, which unsettled him more than anything else that night. Because Emeric did not believe easily and never quickly. He turned to the narrow window and the dark beyond it, and thought of the servant's rising arm, and how near it had come, and how not one soul in 600 had moved, but her. "You named yourself my Luna, in front of the whole Concord," he said at last. "Half the realm heard it. By morning it will be riding out of High March, in every letter that leaves the gate. I said it to save your life," she said. "Not to lay claim to it." Nevertheless, he turned back to face her. "It has been claimed, and I find I have a use for the claim." He watched her the way a man watches a bridge. "He is not certain will bear his weight. If there are hands inside my own house that want me in the ground, then let those hands believe they have already won. Let them believe their king has taken a Luna and gone soft and glad and careless. Men who think they have time make mistakes. You said as much yourself." She understood him before he had finished, and something in her went cold. "You want me to go on pretending," she said. "Until I know whose face I am fighting," Emeric said. "You will be my Luna, in the eyes of this court. You will stand where a Luna stands, and smile where a Luna smiles, and you will help me find the men who sent that blade. When it is done, you may vanish as neatly as you arrived, and I give you my word I will not ask again for the name you will not give. And if I refuse," she said, "then I hand a nameless woman, with no scent to a court that already wants her dead," he said, "without heat, only truth, and we both learn how long you last." Somewhere above them, in the warm and gilded part of the world, a young noblewoman named Elizabeth was being told that the place promised to her, since childhood, the place at the Alpha King's side, had been taken in a single dance by a stranger in grey whom no one could name. And Elizabeth, whose family had spent a great deal of gold and patience to buy that place, was not built to lose it quietly. The woman in grey looked at the king, who had no idea what he was truly asking of her, and she thought of her oath and of the small cold stone that hung against her breastbone, and she said, "Very well, I will be your Luna." She did not tell him that being near him at all was the most dangerous thing she had ever agreed to do. They gave her rooms that shared a wall with the king's. That was the first difficulty, and it was a large one. A Luna slept near her mate. Custom demanded it, and custom in Dunmere was watched by 100 careful eyes, so the woman in grey, who had told the Chancellor at first light that the court might call her Vera, and nothing further, found herself installed behind a carved door. She stood in the middle of the fine, strange room, with its cold hearth and its wide bed, and its tall window full of winter sky, and she pressed one hand flat over her breastbone, over the small, hard shape that hung there beneath her dress. The stone was no larger than a robin's egg, dull and dark, warmed only by her own skin. She had worn one since she was a child. Every warden did. It was the first thing the order gave you, and the last thing they buried you without, and it did the single thing that made a warden a warden. It smothered you. It drank the scent from your skin and the truth from your name and the very shape of you out of the world, so that you could stand in a hall packed with wolves and be no more to their noses than a cold draught under a door. A warden walked unseen, not because she was quiet, though she was that too, but because to every sharp nose in every room, she was simply not there to be found. It was how she had crossed a concord, full of the keenest wolves in the realm, and set her hand upon the king, and never once been scented. It was how she had stayed alive this long. But the stone had a flaw, and the order taught you the flaw the same day they taught you the use, because it had killed wardens who let themselves forget it. The veil the stone drew was not a wall, it was a held breath. And a held breath, held long enough, could slip. When a warden's own heart ran hard, when fear, or grief, or wanting climbed past a certain pitch, the stone could no longer hold all of it, and her true scent would bleed through the veil like lamplight under a shut door. A single thread. But a thread was enough. If the wrong nose stood near, and there was no nose in all of Dunmere, sharper than that of the alpha who ruled it. Which meant that the most dangerous thing Vera could do, of all the dangerous things she had ever done, was to feel something while she stood beside Emmerich. She had made her whole life out of feeling nothing that showed. She told herself standing in that borrowed room that this would be no different. She was proven wrong before the day was out. The court gathered at midday for her presentation because a Luna claimed before 600 witnesses could not simply appear at breakfast the next morning as though nothing had changed. They stood together upon the dais, beneath the great gray banners, the king in black and the woman the court now called Vera, in the deep green they had dressed her in, and an old right speaker, with a wolf's yellow eyes, lifted his weathered hands to bless the bond between them. The blessing required touch. Of course it did. "Give me your hand," Emmerich said, low, "only for her," and she gave it to him. The instant his fingers closed warm over hers, something went through her that had nothing to do with fear. It was warmth, and it was not her own. It came up her arm from the place their skin met, sudden and bright and uninvited, a feeling that belonged to him and had somehow crossed into her. His wariness first, cool and watchful, and then beneath it, a startled thread of something softer that she had no business feeling, from a man she had known the length of a single night. Her breath caught. Her heart, so carefully and so long kept still, lurched once against her ribs, and she felt the stone at her breastbone answer that lurch, felt the held breath of the veil begin, terribly, to slip. Across the dais, the old right speaker lifted his head. The yellow eyes narrowed. The nostrils worked at the air. Vera did the only thing left to her. She let the fear take her all at once, and bent it in the same breath into something the room would forgive, and swayed on her feet as though the solemn weight of the moment had simply overcome a woman new to such heights. The whole court sighed at the sight, charmed to its bones. Emmerich's arm came around her at once, sure and steadying. And in the small sweet chaos of a Luna gone, briefly faint, the thread of true scent that had escaped the veil was swallowed up in the press of warm bodies and candle smoke, and the honest nervous sweat of a watching crowd, and the old wolf with the yellow eyes lowered his head again, no longer certain of what he had so nearly caught. Only Emmerich, holding her, close enough now that her hair brushed the line of his jaw, went utterly still for the space of one long heartbeat, and then said nothing about it. Later, when the rite was done, and the court had drifted off to feast on the strangeness of their new Luna, he walked her back through the cold galleries himself, and sent even the guards on ahead. "You are not the fainting kind," he said, when they were alone with the torches. "I have seen the fainting kind, whole gardens of them. You are not it." "The heat," she said, "and the crowd." "You have no scent," Emmerich said. As though she had not spoken, he said it quietly, watching the passing flames, and not her face, which was a mercy she had not looked for and did not dare trust. "I have never once stood at the shoulder of a living creature and taken nothing from it. A wolf reads the world through his nose. Grief and gladness and a lie and a fever, whether the man across the table means to draw steel before the wine is poured. I read all of it without trying. And from you, since the moment you set your hand on me, there has been nothing. A silence where a person should be." He paused in the torchlight. "And then for one moment on that dais, there was something. Gone again before I could name it, like a door opened on another room and shut before I could see inside." Vera kept her eyes ahead, and her heart, at a cost he could never guess, perfectly and deliberately quiet. "Perhaps your grace is not so unreadable as he likes to believe," she said. He almost smiled. She caught the very edge of it in the moving light, and it did something warm and unwelcome to her chest that she resolved in the same instant never to permit again. They had nearly reached the joined door of their rooms when a voice found them from the far end of the gallery, sweet and carrying and edged like a well-kept knife. "Your Grace." The woman who came toward them out of the shadows was everything Vera had been dressed to imitate, and was not. Isabet moved through the torchlight in pale silk, as though the whole court had been built around her as a setting for a jewel, and she wore a smile that never once climbed as high as her eyes. She sank into a curtsy before the king precisely as deep as it was required to be, and not a hair deeper, then turned to Vera with all the warmth of frost on glass. "I had so hoped to meet the brave woman who saved our king," she said. "How sudden it all was. How very lucky for us that you were there." She let her gaze travel slowly over the green gown and the borrowed jewels, and the whole invented shape of the stranger before her. "And yet not one of us seems to know your house. You must sit with me and tell me everything, where you are from, who your people are." Her smile, sharpened by a degree. "I do so love to know exactly who it is I am standing beside." "You will forgive her," Emmerich said, before Vera could shape an answer. "My Luna has had a long day, and she is very newly among us. There will be time enough for houses and people." "Of course," Elizabeth said, "all the time in the world." But her eyes stayed on Vera a beat longer than courtesy allowed. "We are all so eager to learn what you are." She curtsied again and was gone, and her perfume hung in the cold air behind her, and beneath it, plain to Vera, though not to the king, ran the thin, sour note of a woman who had lost a great deal in a single evening. When the gallery had emptied, Emmerich opened the joining door for her himself, and paused there upon the threshold, and looked at her once more in the dark. "Sleep, Luna," he said, and there was something almost gentle under the word that he had no earthly reason to feel. "Tomorrow we begin to hunt the men who want me dead." He studied her a breath, longer than he needed to. "I still do not know what you are," he said, "but I am beginning to suspect it may be the only thing in this house keeping me alive." He shut the door between their rooms. Vera stood alone in the borrowed dark, with her hand pressed hard over the small dull stone that had, for one impossible moment upon that dais, tried its best to give her away. It had never done such a thing before. Not in 10 years of hiding, not for terror, not for grief, not in the closest calls of a life built entirely out of close calls. It had thinned for one man's touch, as though some part of it wished her to be found. She did not sleep. She lay in the wide bed of a Luna. She was not, and stared at the joining door and tried with all her training to understand why, out of every wolf she had ever hidden from, this was the one the stone would not let her hide from. And on the far side of that same door, near enough to have heard her had she made a sound, the Alpha King lay awake as well, turning a single thought over and over in the dark. that he had held a woman with no scent in all the world, and that for one breath he had smelled something from her after all, and that it had smelled past all sense and reason. Like home. The court of Highmarch had decided what she was before it learned a single true thing about her. By the third day, the whispers had hardened into a shape. The Grey Woman had no house. The Grey Woman had no scent, which the maids swore to, and the lords pretended not to believe, and believed anyway. She had come from nowhere in the middle of the Concord, and put her hand on the king, and unseated Lady Elizabeth, who everyone knew was to have been Luna by spring, and now she walked the galleries in borrowed jewels with her chin up, as though she had been born to them. Some said she had bewitched him, some said worse. None of them said it to her face, because she had a way of looking at a person that made the words dry up, but she heard all of it the same, in the small silences that opened when she passed and closed again behind her. She let them talk. Talk was a kind of weather. You did not argue with it, you dressed for it. What she could not let alone was the hunt. Emmerich had meant what he said in the cold room beneath the hall. The morning after her presentation he sent for her, and he spread across the wide table of his study every report his people had gathered on the servant with the blade, and he did not once treat her like an ornament. That surprised her. She had braced for a man who wanted a pretty silence at his side, and got instead one who slid a paper toward her and asked plainly what she made of it. The servant had a name and a village and a mother, all of them real, all of them ordinary. He had worked the kitchens of Highmarch for 2 years without a single mark against him. And then, 4 days before the Concord, he had come into a small purse of silver that no one could account for, and he had told his mother he would soon come home a wealthy man. Someone paid him, Vera said, running her eye down the page. Someone patient. 2 years is a long time to keep a knife in your kitchen and wait. Emmerich watched her read. You have done this before, he said. Not a question, a naming. I have watched men, she said, which was true, and told him nothing. They worked through the morning that way, the king and the woman with no name, and it was easier than it had any right to be. He was quick, and he was dry, and when she said a sharp thing, he did not flinch from it. He turned it over and gave it back sharper. Twice, she forgot to guard her face. Once she caught herself almost laughing, and killed it in her throat, and felt the stone at her breastbone twitch a warning, and went cold and careful again, and saw him notice the going cold, and say nothing. That was the trouble with him. He noticed everything, and said nothing. And a woman could grow to want to be noticed by a man like that, and wanting was the one thing she could not afford. That night, she did what she had been trained her whole life to do. She went where she was not meant to be, and she was not seen. The stone made it simple. She left her rooms after the candles were down, and moved through the sleeping keep like a draft, past dozing guards who never lifted their heads, drawn by the one thread she had marked and could not yet pull. Because, on the dais, and again, in the study, a thing had been nagging at her. Doran. The Chancellor had gone still when she spoke of hands inside the house, still in the particular way of a man who has heard his own secret said aloud by a stranger. So, she followed the Chancellor. It took 2 nights. On the second, she found him in the old records room in the East Wing, long after any honest man had reason to be there. And he was not alone. Vera pressed herself into the dark beyond the door and made her heart lie flat, and listened. The other voice was Elizabeth's. You promised me it would be done at the Concord. Elizabeth was saying, low and furious. You promised me a widow's court by the new year, and instead I am curtsying to a scentless nobody in my own gown. The knife was clumsy, Doran said, unbothered. The knife is what one gets for cheap, and we will not be cheap again. He does not suspect me. He suspects the heir. And with a grieving realm and no heir, when it is finally done, the crown has nowhere to go but to a steady hand, the great houses already trust. He let that sit. Yours by marriage, my lady, as we agreed. Patience. I have been patient, a generation, Elizabeth said. Then be patient a season more. Doran's voice dropped, and Vera strained after it. There is only the one difficulty, and I mean to end it. The Grey Woman. She saw the knife before it was drawn. No lady of any house I know can do that. So I have sent word south, to a man who makes it his trade to learn what people are when they will not say. When he comes, we will learn what she is. And a thing with a true name, he said softly, is a thing that can be broken. Vera did not breathe. The stone against her skin was the only warm thing in the world. She had crouched in worse places than this, and heard worse things, and she had learned long ago to keep her breathing shallow and her heart slow while men spoke of murder 3 steps away. But her heart wanted to race now, and the wanting was itself the danger, because a racing heart thinned the veil, and a thinned veil in a room this small, with 2 enemies this near, would end everything at once. So she did the old discipline. She counted the Chancellor's words like beads on a string, and let nothing beneath them touch her, and she was stone, and the stone held. She stayed until they parted, and went their separate careful ways, and then she went back, through the sleeping keep, the way she had come unseen, her mind turning like a mill. She had it all now. The Chancellor and the cast-off bride, bound together, the assassination theirs, another coming, cleaner, and a hunter already riding north who made it his trade to unmask exactly the sort of thing she was. And she could tell Emmerich none of it, not one word. Because the first question any sane king would ask was how his nameless Luna came to be crouched in the dark outside a locked room in the deepest hour of the night, hearing what no ordinary woman could have heard, and there was no answer to that question that did not end at the stone against her breast and the truth it hid. She reached her own door as the sky went gray at its edges. On the far side of the joining wall the king slept, not knowing the man he trusted most had already sold him, not knowing the only soul who could prove it had sworn an oath that would cost her life to speak. For the first time in her guarded life, Vera did not know what her oath required of her. She should have pulled back after that night. Every hard year of her training told her to. A warden who let herself be known was already half dead, and there was no faster way to be known than to care, and no one on earth more dangerous to care for than the man she had sworn in silence to protect. Instead, she was in his study again, the next evening, and the one after that, and the one after that. They told the court it was the work of a new Luna, learning her lord's affairs. It was that. It was also the only place in Highmarch where Vera could stop pretending to be someone with a house and a past, because with Emmerich she was already a mystery, and a mystery does not have to lie about small things. She could be quiet with him, she could be strange. He asked her nothing, she could not answer, and did not hold the silences against her, and slowly, without deciding to, she began to spend her evenings the way a person spends time with someone they have chosen. There were small things. She learned that he took his tea bitter and then forgot it, until it went cold, and she began, without a word passing between them, to move the cup back into his reach when the work carried him away from it, and he began, without a word either, to drink it while it was still warm. She learned the particular set of his jaw that meant a report had troubled him, and the slower one that meant he was tired and would not say so. He learned that she never once sat with her back to a door, and after the 3rd evening he simply stopped taking the chair that would have forced her to it, and gave her the seat that faced the room, and neither of them ever named the reason. It was a strange courtship for 2 people who had agreed there was nothing between them to court. It was, Vera thought, the nearest thing to being known that she had allowed herself in a decade, and she could not make herself stop. He was not what the court believed either. The court saw a hard king with a soldier's shoulders and a soldier's short way of speaking, a man who had taken a throne and a bride in one season and shown no softness over either. Vera saw a man who worked until the candles guttered, because the work was the only thing that quieted him, and who flinched, very slightly, every time a servant called him, "Your Grace," as though the words still belonged to someone else. One night, she learned why. They had been reading letters late, hunting the second thread she knew was there and could not name for him. When she asked, because she had wanted to for days, how he had come to be king, she said it lightly. She was not ready for the change that came over him. "My brother," he said. He set the letter down. "Taven," he said. He was the elder. He was the one they raised for it, and he was good at it. Better than I will ever be. The people loved him. I loved him. He was meant to sit here, and I was meant to hold his border and be glad of it. And I was glad of it. He turned the ring on his hand. Once, twice. He died 2 winters ago. A fever, they said. It took him in 9 days. And the crown came to me the way a house comes to the man who happens to be standing in it when the roof falls. He was quiet a moment. At the end, he did not know me, Emmerich said. 9 days of fever, and by the last of it he called me by our father's name, and asked me to go and see to the horses. So I sat with him, and I told him I would see to the horses. It seemed to ease him. He looked down at his own hands. I have never told anyone that. Vera sat very still. I never wanted this, Emmerich said, quietly, to the candle rather than to her. Every day I sit in his chair and give his orders, in a voice that is not his, and half this court looks at me, and sees the wrong brother wearing the crown. He gave a short breath that was not a laugh. And now it seems they are no longer content to only think it. She understood him. Then in a way she had not before. The distance in him that she had taken in her worst private hours for coldness toward her. It was not coldness. It was a man braced against a life he had never asked to carry, holding himself apart from all of it because everything he had ever let himself love had been taken from him. A brother, a boarder, a smaller and simpler life. He kept the world at arm's length because the world had taught him what it cost to hold it close. She knew a great deal about holding the world at arm's length, and she thought, though she did not say it, of the order that had made her. The wardens took their children young, from families glad of one less mouth, or from no family at all, and they taught them first to feel nothing, and second to be no one, because a guardian who could be known could be turned against the very line she guarded. She had been given to the Alpha Kings of Dunmere before she was old enough to remember choosing anything. She had spent her whole hidden life, keeping men like this one alive from the shadows, and vanishing before they ever knew a shadow had been there. And never once in all of it had one of them looked at her across a table and called her the only person who understood. "I am sorry," she said, and meant it so plainly that it startled them both. He looked up at her. For a moment, neither of them guarded anything, and the study was very quiet, and the candle threw its small warm circle around the two of them, and nothing else in the world. "You are the only person in this keep," he said slowly, "who has said that to me, and meant my brother, and not the crown." She did not know how to answer, so she did the unforgivable thing. She let herself feel it, the ache of him, the loneliness that matched her own so exactly it frightened her, and for one unguarded breath, she did not force it down. The stone at her breast went warm, and then hot, and the veil thinned. She felt him before she saw him react. Through no touch at all this time, only the narrow air between them, his grief crossed into her, dark and old and heavy, and beneath it, rising, something that was not grief. Something that turned toward her the way a cold man turns toward a fire. And she knew, with a plunging certainty, that in the same instant he had caught the edge of her, not her face, her, the true scent of her, bleeding through the stone, filling the small warm space between them for the length of one breath. Emmerich went rigid. His head came up. His eyes found her, and there was something wild and disbelieving in them. The look of a man scenting a thing that could not be, a thing he had caught once before on a dais, and told himself he had imagined. "You," he said. The word had a weight the small room could not hold. Vera stood so fast her chair scraped stone, the motion broke it. Fear flooded in cold and clean and slammed the veil shut, and the warmth vanished from the air between them as though a door had closed. His face changed, the certainty guttering into confusion, the scent gone before he could seize it, leaving him grasping after something already fading. "I should go," she said. "It is late." He stood as well. "Wait," he said. "That. Just now." He pressed a hand briefly to his own chest, over the place where a bond would sit, looking almost afraid of it. "What was that?" "Nothing," she said. "Good night, Your Grace." She was at the joining door before he spoke again, and what he said stopped her, with her hand flat on the wood. "It is the second time," he said quietly behind her. "The dais, and now. Twice I have caught something from a woman who has no scent at all, and both times it has smelled like the one thing I stopped letting myself want." He was silent a moment. "I do not know what you are, Vira. But I am done pretending. I feel nothing when you are near." She did not turn around. She could not. If she turned around, he would see her face, and her face would tell him everything the stone was still fighting to hide. "Good night," she said again, and went through the door, and shut it, and stood on the other side of it, with her back against the wood, and both hands pressed over the small stone that had, twice now, tried its best to hand her to the one man on earth she could not have. She lasted 2 days. 2 days of the confession, sitting between them, in every room, unanswered, growing. 2 days of telling herself the wise thing, the only thing, was to find the second thread, break the plot and vanish before the hunter from the south ever reached the gate. She was very good at the wise thing. She had built a life on it. The wise thing had carried her through fire and frost and the long patience of enemies, and it had never once, in all those years, felt like cowardice until now. On the third night, she went to him anyway. He was still at the wide table when she came through the joining door without knocking, and he rose, when he saw her face, because her face was not guarded, and he had never once seen it unguarded. "Vira," he said. "You said you were done pretending," she said. Her heart was going hard and she let it. "Rules be hanged, just this once." "So am I." She crossed the room before her courage could fail her. "I know what I am supposed to do. I am supposed to feel nothing. I felt nothing for 10 years and I was good at it, until you—" She stopped an arm's length from him, close enough to see his breath change. "I am tired of feeling nothing." For a moment she thought he would close the distance. She saw him want to. She felt it, warm and sudden across the little space. The pull of him leaning toward her. Then he stepped back. It was gentle. That was the cruelty of it. He stepped back and set a careful, deliberate silence between them, and when he spoke, his voice was rough, with the cost of it. "I will not," he said. She stood very still. "You came to me in a burning hall, and put your life between me and a knife," he said, "and I gave you a bargain in return, not a courtship. You are here because I asked it of you, to catch the men who want me dead. A woman bound to a king by a claim she made to save his life is not free, Vera. Whatever her heart tells her." At midnight, he held himself rigid, every line of him fighting to keep the space he had made. "When this is done, you may walk out of Highmarch, owing me nothing. I will not use these walls, or that bargain, or your fear, to take something you cannot freely give." He meant it as honor. She heard only the shape of it, which was no. She had laid herself bare, the first time in her guarded life, and the answer was a careful step backward and a kind refusal. She had faced drawn steel without her pulse so much as changing. This was worse than steel, and she could not understand why a thing made only of words should cut so deep where a blade never had. "Of course," she said. Her voice came out even. "Years of training were good for one thing. Forgive me. I misunderstood." "You did not." He began reaching for her. She was already turning away, and that was what saved her life. The window burst inward. She felt the wind of it before she heard the sound. A hard, cold line of air passed her cheek where her throat had been a breath before. And then Emmerich moved faster than any burdened man should move, faster than thought, and drove into her, turning her, putting the broad shield of his own body between her and the dark beyond the ruined glass. The bolt meant for her heart took him high in the back. He made a sound she would hear for the rest of her life. They went down together, his weight bearing her to the cold stone, and she was already twisting beneath him, already reaching, and her hand found the shaft standing out of him, and closed on it and came away wet and burning, because the head of it was not iron. It was silver. She knew what silver did to a wolf. Every warden knew. And she knelt there, in the shattered dark, with the King of Dunmere going grey and heavy in her arms, silver in his blood, and the poison of it already spreading, and she understood, with a cold, that had nothing to do with the broken window. That the one thing that might save him was to be exactly what she could not let a single soul in this keep discover. She was. Get the healers. Someone was shouting in the corridor. Get the healers. The king is down. Vera did not wait for healers. She had perhaps 100 beats of a heart before the silver reached his and stopped it, and healers in a border court did not know silver the way a warden knew silver. She got her shoulder under him and dragged him clear of the shattered glass and laid him on his side, and she snapped the head from the bolt and drew the shaft in one clean pull, the way she had been taught fast, before the wound could close around it. And he arched and made that sound again, and she set her knee against his spine and held him and did not stop. When the door burst open on guards and a night-robed healer, she was already the Luna they needed her to be. Out, she said, in a voice that did not sound like fear. All of you. Fetch me hot water and clean linen and the black salve from the still room, the one for burns, and then you will wait beyond that door and let no one past it, not a lord. Not the chancellor, no one. Your grace, the healer began. We must. He was shielding me when it struck, Vera said. And it was true. And the truth of it put such a blade into her voice that the woman flinched. I will not have a crowd, breathing on an open wound. Bring what I asked, and go. They went. It was astonishing, she would think later, what a court would do for a woman it had spent a fortnight despising, if only she stopped asking and started telling. Then she was alone with him, and the pretending fell away, and there was only the work. She knew silver. The order taught you silver the way it taught you your own name, because silver was what they used on your kind when they finally caught you. And a warden who did not know how to keep it from the heart did not live to be an old one. She packed the wound and drew the black poison up and out in the old slow way, her hands sure where a lady's would have shaken, and she watched the gray climb his throat and fought it back and lost ground and fought it back again. Twice in those hours someone tried the door, and twice she called out that the king was resting and must not be disturbed, and made her voice the voice of a frightened new wife, rather than a woman with a dead man's poison up to her wrists. Everything she was doing, the packing of the wound, the drawing of the silver, the old low words she breathed over it, would have told any wolf who saw it that the gray Luna was no lady of any house. So she worked alone, and she listened to the keep with half an ear the whole while, the way she had been trained to listen, and she did not let herself think about what would become of either of them if the night went wrong. He burned. By the deep of the night, his skin was fever-hot under her palms, and he had begun to speak, the way the poison do, to people who were not in the room. Taven, he said once, clear as a bell, see to the horses. And then, lower, broken, I could not. I am sorry, I could not. Vera pressed the cool cloth to his brow and said nothing, and her chest ached, in a way, the work did not require. She had guarded 3 alpha kings across her years, from a distance, as a shadow guards, and she had watched one of them buried and felt nothing she was permitted to feel. She had never once sat inside the room. She had never once held the hand. Then his hand came up, blind, searching, and closed hard around her wrist. You, he said. Her heart stopped. His eyes were open and fever-bright and fixed on her, and she knew he was not seeing the Luna, not the gray woman, not any of the shapes the court had hung on her. his nostrils flared, his grip tightened. And she understood, with a cold jolt, that in his delirium every guard he owned had fallen away, and the wolf beneath the man was awake and reaching, and it had scented her. Truly, her. The thing the stone had spent a fortnight fighting to bury. "Where did you go?" he said, wretched, to a woman he could not name and somehow knew. "I looked for you. I have been looking for you my whole life. Do not go." The stone at her breast was scalding now. The veil worn thin by fear and grief and the long hours of touching him was failing all at once, and she felt it happen, felt her true scent rise and fill the room, and worse, far worse, she felt something reach for her out of him. Not his hand, something under the hand. His wolf, guttering low as the silver dragged it toward the dark, turned toward her the way a drowning man turns toward the one solid thing in the water. And it reached for her the way a mate reaches for a mate, to be anchored, to be held to the living world. She should have wrenched free. She should have slammed the stone shut and let the fever run and prayed he lived. Instead, because he was dying, because she could not watch another Alpha King slip into the dark on her watch, because her whole hidden life had been given to keeping this line breathing, she did the thing a warden must never do. She let it happen. She opened what little of herself the stone would allow, and she let his failing wolf take hold of her, and she anchored him, and held on. His breathing steadied. The gray at his throat stopped climbing. Somewhere beyond the door a floorboard creaked, and a voice, Elizabeth's sweet and carrying, asked the guards very kindly whether she might not just look in on the poor king, and Vera's heart lurched, and the scent that filled the room thinned mercifully as her fear went sharp and cold. And by the time the guards had finished refusing the lady in their flat, frightened way, the air was only smoke and blood and salve again, and nothing a wolf at the door could have named. Vera sat with her hand in the king's all the rest of that night, and did not let go. By the gray of dawn the fever broke, his skin cooled, his breathing came deep and slow and his own. He was going to live. She had done it. She sagged where she sat, a lifetime of training, the only thing holding her upright, and let herself, for one moment, simply be glad. Then his brow furrowed in his sleep, and his hand moved on the blanket, and she saw him reach the way a wolf reaches without waking for the shape of its own wolf, to be sure of it, the way a man might touch his own pulse. And she watched his face go slack, and then tight, and then afraid, still half in sleep, reaching again, and finding nothing there. Wherever his wolf had gone in the night, it had not come back. The healers had 100 soft words for it, and not one of them was the true word. The wound would knit, they said. His strength would return in time. As for the other thing, the shift, they only looked at their hands. Silver was silver. Some men came back to their wolves after such a wound. Some men did not. They could not say which he would be. Emeric heard them out in silence, sitting up against the pillows with his jaw set, and when they had gone, he turned his face to the window and did not speak for a long time. "You should have let it take me," he said at last. Fira, sorting linen, she did not need to sort, went still. "The bolt was meant for you," he said. "I saw it come. I had time to think, in the half-breath before. And what I thought was that a king who cannot keep one woman safe in his own study is no king worth the name. And I would rather take it than watch it take you." He gave a low, bitter sound. "And now, I am a king who cannot shift, which the court will learn inside a week, and then I will be no king at all. So," he turned the ring on his hand, "you should have let it take me. It would have been tidier." "Do not," Vera said, more sharply than she meant to, and he looked at her startled. "Do not sit there and tell me your life would have been a tidy loss. I will not hear it." Something in his face eased, very slightly, at the heat in her voice. They came for him within the week, as he had said they would, though not with knives this time. The chancellor came, grave and gentle, with talk of the king's health and the realm's nerves, and how unwise it would be for the great houses to see their alpha unable to stand at the head of a hunt. There were rumors already, Doran said sorrowfully. Ugly ones. A king who could not shift. It would be a mercy, would it not, for his grace to withdraw a while to some quiet place to recover his strength away from watching eyes. Vyra watched the chancellor lay the trap with a craftsman's care and understood it perfectly. Get the wounded king out of his own capital. Let the throne sit empty and the whispers grow. And when the realm was frightened enough and leaderless enough, step into the gap with clean hands and a grieving face. She very nearly told Emmerich everything. Then the words were in her mouth. But the same wall stood where it had always stood, because she could not prove a word of it, without answering how she knew, and so she said, only when Doran had gone, you should go. Not for the reason he wants, for the one he does not. Emmerich looked at her. He wants you alone, and forgotten, she said. So do not be alone. Take the people you trust and go somewhere you can see every road in and out, and let him think he has won the board, while you quietly take back the pieces. She paused. Where were you, happiest, before the crown? He did not have to think about it. Kalmar, he said. The marches. I held the border there for 9 years. It is cold, and it is plain, and there is nothing to do but ride the line and know your neighbors. I was warden of the marches. It was the best work I ever had. Then let us go and be wardens of the marches, Vera said, and did not let her voice catch on the word. They went at dawn, quietly, with a dozen men Emmerich would have trusted with his life, and did. It shamed him to be carried down to the carriage. She could see it in every line of him, a king leaving his own hall like a corpse who had not finished dying. She sat across from him as the walls of Highmarch fell behind them and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would not make it worse. And after a long while he reached across the space between them and took her hand, and held it, and neither of them spoke of that either. Kalmar was everything he had said. A low, gray, keep on a hard gray hill, wind off the moors. A village of folk who had known Emmerich as a border lord and greeted him now not as a king, but as their old warden come home, which did more for him in an afternoon than the healers had in a week. And there, away from the court that watched, something in both of them began to loosen. She stopped guarding quite so hard. He stopped bracing quite so much. They ate their meals together at a plain, scarred table and argued about the plot, like two people who enjoyed arguing. And, in the long gray evenings, he taught her the border songs, badly, and she pretended not to know them, though the order had taught her every one. And once she laughed, really laughed, before she could stop it. And he looked at her as though she had handed him something rare. There was a night, the wind dropped and the sky over the moors went thick with stars, more than Vyra had ever seen from behind the walls of a keep, and Emmerich had them carry a chair to the top of the hill so he could sit under them. He could walk a little, by then, slow and careful, leaning on her, but the climb was beyond him yet, and he hated that she saw it. She pretended not to. She had spent her life pretending not to see things, and for once, it was a kindness instead of a weapon. They sat a long time in the cold with a blanket between them and the whole wheeling sky above. My brother used to say the border was the only honest place in the realm, Emmerich said. No court, no lies. Just the line and the men who hold it and the weather trying to kill you. He was quiet. I think I understand now why they wanted him and not me. He was the one people followed. I was only ever the spare. He said it without self-pity, as a plain fact, and that was somehow worse. You are not the spare, Vyra said. He turned his head to look at her. I have watched a great many men who were meant to lead, she said, choosing each word around the edge of everything she could not say. Most of them wanted the following. You want the work. That is the rarer thing, and the better one. And if this realm had any sense, it would see it. She stopped, aware she had said too much, aware of the warmth spilling out of the stone. He did not look away. In the starlight, his eyes had gone dark and steady on her face, and she felt the pull of him across the small, cold space, and this time neither of them stepped back, because there was nowhere to step, only the hilltop and the stars, and the thing that had been building between them since a burning hall. He lifted his hand slow and set it against her cheek, and his thumb moved once across her skin, and through that single point of warmth the bond opened wide, his wonder and his want and his careful, fragile hope pouring into her all at once. And she knew he felt hers answer, felt it the way you feel the sun come out from behind a cloud. Then a dog barked down in the village, and a door banged, and the ordinary world came rushing back, and she turned her face out of his hand before it could become something she could not undo. "Not yet," she said, though he had not asked. "Not while there is still a thing I have not told you." He let his hand fall. "All right," he said, and there was no anger in it, only that patience of his that undid her more surely than any demand could have. "When you are ready." And they sat under the stars a while longer, not touching, and it was the nearest thing to peace she had ever known. What she did not know, what neither of them knew, was that back at Highmarch a lean, quiet man had ridden in from the south 3 days after they left, and had asked very politely to be shown the rooms the gray woman had slept in, and had knelt on the cold floor of her empty chamber, and breathed slow and deep at the place where a scent should have been and was not, and had smiled to himself in the dark, because a silence where a scent should be was to a man of his trade the loudest sound in the world. He knew exactly one kind of creature that left no scent behind it, and he set out north the next morning to prove it. Winter softened toward its end at Kelmar, and Vira fell the rest of the way in love with him, and let herself, because on the marches there was no court to see it, and for a little while she let herself pretend there never would be again. He grew stronger. He could walk the yard now, on his own, slow, stubborn, refusing her arm and then taking it when he thought no one was watching. The wolf did not come back. He had stopped reaching for it in his sleep, which was worse in its way. A man, learning to live in a house with a locked room he no longer tried the handle of, but he laughed more. He teased her, dry and quiet, and she gave it back, and the plain scarred table saw more gladness in those weeks than that gray keep had likely held in 100 years. One evening she was pouring the last of the wine, and he caught her hand, the one holding the cup, and did not let go, and looked up at her, and she set the cup down and did not pull away, and he stood, slow and careful, until they were a breath apart, and this time it was Vera who closed the distance. She kissed him. The stone at her breast flared hot as a coal, and she did not care. The veil went to nothing, and she did not care about that either, because his arms came around her, and the bond opened all the way. And there was no more careful, narrow thread of him, there was all of him, his want and his tenderness and his disbelief that this was his to have pouring into her, while everything she had spent so long hiding poured back. And for one long, shining moment, two people who had each been trained and beaten into solitude were neither of them alone. When they broke apart, they were both unsteady. He pressed his forehead to hers. "Whatever you have not told me," he said roughly, "tell me tomorrow, or next year. Tell me never. I no longer care what you are. I know who you are. And that is enough," she almost told him then. She would think about that afterward, for the rest of her life, how close she had come, how different everything might have been if she had simply said the words with his forehead against hers and the fire low. For 3 days she carried the telling around with her like a stone heavier than the one at her breast. She rehearsed it in the yard and in the dark. She would tell him what she was. She would tell him she had been sworn to his line before she could walk, that she had come to the Concord not by chance, but because a warden had marked a threat to the king and moved to end it, that the woman he had fallen for had begun as a duty and become the only thing she had ever chosen for herself. She would tell him, and let him do with it what he would. She had even chosen the hour that very evening, after the men had gone to their beds. She was, for the first time in her life, going to hand another living person the whole truth of herself, and let the handing be an act of love instead of a fatal mistake. She did not get the chance. The rider came at dawn, half dead in the saddle, one of the men Emmerich had left with ears at high march. They gathered in the cold hall to hear it, and it was worse than even Vera had feared. Doran had moved. Not with a knife this time, but with the law, which was the one weapon Emmerich could not shield himself from at 100 leagues distance. The Chancellor had stood before the assembled great houses and spoken, gravely and with great sorrow, of a king so broken by the attempt on his life that he had fled his own capital and could no longer take his wolf's shape, a king plainly unfit, by every old custom of the pack, to rule wolves. He had proposed a regent to hold the realm until it could be set right himself, and a marriage, in time, to bind the wavering houses back together. To Lady Elizabeth, whose claim, he reminded them, had never truly been answered. Half the houses had cheered, the rest had not dared not to. Emmerich took it standing, one hand flat on the scarred table, and when the rider had finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he sent them all out, all but her. "It is finished," he said. He did not sound broken. That was the worst of it. He sounded calm, the calm of a man who has done his grieving in advance. A king who cannot shift and cannot show his face in his own capital is a king in name only, and names blow away. Doran has the houses. He has the law. In a season he will have the crown, and there is nothing at Kelmar but a dozen loyal men and a warden who cannot lift his own wolf. He looked at her. "And you?" Virus said nothing. She did not like the gentleness that had come into his voice. "You are free," he said. "I release you from the bargain, from the claim, from all of it, here, before there is any witness left to hold you to it." He said it steadily, though it cost him. She could feel exactly what it cost him, pouring cold and gray off him through the space between them. When Doran comes, and he will come, he will not leave a loose thread like a nameless Luna, alive to be a banner for anyone. A woman tied to a fallen king is a dead woman, Vera. But a woman no one can name, a woman with no scent, a woman who can walk out of a keep in the night and simply not be there. He paused, hearing himself describe her exactly. That woman can vanish and live, so go. While there is still a road out, he turned away so she would not see his face. "Do not make me watch them kill you for the crime of having saved me. Please, go." He had never once, in all the weeks she had known him, asked her for a single thing. Not comfort, not company, not the truth. She kept withholding from him night after night. This was the first thing he had ever asked of her, and it was that she leave him to die alone. For a moment, Vera could not speak at all. He had done it again, this maddening, honorable, self-condemning man. He had looked at the two of them and reached unerringly for the version of things that cost him everything and spared her, and he had called it setting her free. "I am not going anywhere," she said. He shut his eyes. "Emmerich." She crossed to him and took his face in her hands and made him look at her. "Listen to me. There is a great deal I have not told you, and I am going to tell you all of it, and soon. But hear this first, plainly, so there is no mistaking it. I did not stay because of a bargain. I have not stayed for a bargain in a long time. I choose." The horn on the gate tower cut her off. One long note, and then a second. The note that meant riders on the North Road. And Vira was at the arrow slit before the sound had died, and her blood went to ice. A company was coming up the hard gray hill under the Chancellor's colors, mailed and mounted, more men than a dozen loyal borderers could hope to hold. And out ahead of them all, alone, unhurried, rode a lean, quiet man in a plain, dark coat, who carried no banner and needed none. A man who lifted his head as he neared the walls and breathed the air, slow and deep, the way a hound breathes when at last it has the scent, or in his case, when at last it has the silence where scent should be. The finder had come to Kelmar. and he had not come to unmask a lady. "Open the gates," the finder called up, pleasant and clear, "or we burn them. The Chancellor has no wish to harm his king. He wishes only to bring his grace safely home to be cared for." His voice carried easily on the cold wind, "and to collect the creature that has been whispering in his ear. You know the one, the gray woman, the woman with no scent." He smiled up at the walls. "Send her out, and the rest of you may live." In the cold hall behind the gate, the dozen loyal men who had followed their warden to the ends of the realm turned, slowly, and looked at Feyre. They had heard it now. No scent. The thing the maids had sworn to. And she watched the fear come into their honest faces, the old animal fear of a wolf, for the thing it cannot smell. And she understood that the finder had already half won, because he had made her monstrous with 3 words, and frightened men do terrible things to keep themselves safe. "Give her to them," one of the men said, low. "It is her they want, not him." "We do not," Emmerich began, and his voice cracked like a whip. But Vera put her hand on his arm. "It is all right," she said. She stepped into the middle of the hall, where they could all see her. For the whole of her life, she had built herself around a single law, the first and the last law of the Wardens. Be no one, be unseen. A guardian who is known is a guardian undone, and a warden who reveals herself brings ruin on the order and death on herself. She had kept that law through fire and through grief and through the closest calls a life could hold. She had kept it, help her, through him. She looked at Emmerich, at his broken, proud face, at the man who had thrown himself in front of a silver bolt and then tried to set her free rather than watch her die for him, and she found that the law had simply stopped mattering somewhere on a hilltop under the stars. "I am going to show you what I am," she said to him, only to him. "I need you not to be afraid of me." "I could never," he said, and meant it. And that was the last thing she let herself feel before she did it. She reached into her collar and closed her hand around the little dollstone that had hidden her since she was a child, and she pulled, and the cord snapped, and she let it fall to the flagstones. The hall changed. It was as though a door had been flung wide in a sealed house. Her scent, 10 years suppressed, rushed out all at once and filled the gray stone hall to its rafters, and every wolf in it went rigid, because it was not the scent of a monster at all. It was the scent of a warden of the old order, clean and cold and sharp as winter iron. The scent of the sworn shadow guardians of the Alpha line that every wolf of Dunmere had heard of in cradle stories, and no living wolf. And the loyal men who had reached for their blades a moment before now stood with the hair standing up on their arms in something closer to awe, but that was not the door that mattered. Because when the stones struck the floor, the thing it had been smothering all along, the thing that had thinned it on a dais and in a study and on a hilltop under the stars, came free with it. And the bond between Vira and Emmerich did not open by a thread this time. It opened entirely, and it completed, and it locked, mate to mate, with a force that took the breath from them both. Emmerich staggered, his hand went to his chest. And she felt him feel it, felt his whole world reorder itself in a single heartbeat, around the one impossible fact that was pouring through him and through her. Both, the fact the stone had spent her whole life keeping even from her. She was his mate, not a lady, not a stranger, not a nameless woman who had wandered in from nowhere. His, the true one. The order had not sent a guardian to a king by chance. It had spent years hiding a mate from the very wolf she was bound to. Because a warden who bonds to the line she guards is a warden it can no longer control. And now she understood every strange thing that had ever passed between them. Why the stone failed only for him. Why his grief could cross into her on the open air. Why, in a hall of 600, she had felt the knife meant for him as though it had been aimed at her own heart. The bond had been there since the first note of that first dance, reaching, and the stone had been fighting it, and the stone had lost. "You," Emmerich said, for the 3rd time, and this time it was not a question, and it was not a fear. It was a homecoming. And then his face changed, because he was a quick man even now, and the other half of it landed. You were sent, he said slowly. You are sworn to my line. Everything you have done, the hall, the vigil, staying when I told you to go. He swallowed. It was your duty. You never had a choice in any of it. There it was. The old self-condemning reach for the version that spared her and gutted him. He would rather believe he had been a warden's assignment than let himself have been loved, because a man who has only ever been the spare does not know how to be chosen. No, Vera said. She crossed to him through the swirling scent and the staring men, and took his face in her hands the way she had at the burning hall's end, the way she had under the stars. My oath told me to keep you breathing from the shadows, and never once let you see my face, she said. My oath is on that floor, with the stone. I broke it. Do you understand me? I have thrown away the only life I have ever had, in front of witnesses, and there is no undoing it and no forgiveness for it in my order. And I did it anyway, for you, because somewhere between a burning hall and a hilltop I stopped being a warden who was guarding you and became a woman who could not watch you die. She was crying, she realized, distantly, which she had not done since she was a child. Not duty, not the bond, not magic. I choose you, Imeric. I chose you before I even knew the bond was there. I would choose you with no bond at all. For one heartbeat, the whole gray hall held its breath. And then, deep in the locked room of him that he had stopped trying the handle of, something answered. She felt it before he did, felt it come roaring up through the completed bond, like a river through a broken dam. The wolf the silver had driven into the dark, called back not by any healer's salve, but by the one thing an alpha's wolf will always answer, its mate in danger and its mate's choice ringing in its blood. Emeric gasped. His eyes flared, gold. And between one breath and the next, the man who could not shift, the king the chancellor had declared broken and unfit before all the great houses of the realm, threw back his head and shifted, whole and vast and shining, into the largest wolf any wolf in that hall had ever seen. The loyal men fell to their knees. Beyond the gate, the finder's pleasant voice had stopped. What came after was quick, the way real things are, quick. Emeric went over the wall, like grey water, and the sight of the unbroken Alpha King of Dunmere, the king who by every law could not be standing, tore the heart out of the Chancellor's borrowed company before a single blow was struck, because they had ridden north on the word that this man was finished, and here he was. More wolf than any of them had ever seen, with a warden of the old order coming down the wall at his flank like a blade made of shadow. Men who fight for a lie do not fight long against the truth of their own eyes. Half of them threw down their arms. The rest ran. Only two did not run. The finder stood his ground in the churned mud of the yard, and he looked at Vira with something almost like satisfaction, a craftsman who has found at last the rare thing he was hired to find, and he said, I have hunted your kind for 20 years. He inclined his head to her, courteous to the end. It was worth the ride. And then he simply turned and walked away down the north road, his work in some private way of his own, complete, and no one stopped him. And in the center of the yard, alone now, his sword useless in his hand and his borrowed soldiers fled, stood Lord Doran. He did not beg, she would give him that. He looked at the great wolf, pacing toward him and the warden at its side, and he understood that the board had been swept, and he only smiled his tired, courteous smile and said, You were never in the reports. A warden. I looked for everything, and I never once looked for a story. Why, Taven, Vira said, because she had known the moment the wolf came back. She had known. A fever that takes an alpha in 9 days is no fever. Doran's smile thinned. He was the better king, he said simply. The people loved him. There was no wedge to drive, no fear to work, nothing for a patient man to do but wait a lifetime in the shadow of a wolf. The whole realm adored. He shrugged. An old man's shrug. So I did not wait. Silver, then too, in small doses, over a winter, in the wine. slow. He looked at Emmerich, huge and golden-eyed and shaking with a fury that had gone beyond sound. The spare, I thought, would be easier. He gave a small, dry laugh. I have never in my life been so wrong about a man. Emmerich of Dunmere, who had sat 2 winters beside a brother dying of a fever that was not a fever, and held his hand, and promised to see to the horses, took 1 step toward the man who had poisoned him, and then stopped, and did not tear him apart, though every wolf in that yard could feel how badly he wished to. "Not here," he said. When he had shifted back enough to speak, his voice wrecked. "Not quick. You will stand before the great houses you lied to, and you will say every word of that again, and then you will answer for my brother by their law, in the light where everyone can see." He turned his back on him, which was the greater contempt. Take him. They took him. They went back to High March, in the last of the winter, and the second time Vera entered the great hall, no one mistook her for a nobody in a borrowed gown. The story had gone before her, the way stories do, a warden of the old order, out of the cradle tales, come to guard the alpha line in the flesh, the king, who could not shift, risen whole. The chancellor who had murdered one king and tried to murder another, dragged into the light of the very houses he had lied to answer by their law. Half the court that had whispered behind their hands now could not meet her eyes, and the other half bowed too low, and Vera found she cared nothing for either. She had spent her life being no one. She had no wish now to be worshipped. She wished only to be, at last, simply seen. Elizabeth was not in the hall. Elizabeth was in the south with what remained of her family's name, which was very little. Having wagered everything on a patient man's patience and lost the whole of it in a single grey afternoon at Kelmar. She had wanted a crown and a court and a king who came with them. She was left with none of the 3. The old right speaker with the yellow eyes, who had so nearly caught her on that first dais, sought her out before the dancing, and bowed as low to her as he would have bowed to the king. The cradle tales never once said a warden might be beautiful, he told her. I am glad to have lived to correct them. It was the first kindness the court had ever offered her, and she found, to her surprise, that she could accept it. There was music that night because Emmerich commanded it, and when the first slow measure began, he crossed the floor to where Vera stood, in front of the whole staring court, and he held out his hand. "Pretend nothing," he said, "only for her," his mouth curving. "Just dance with me." She put her hand in his. There was no knife in the room this time, no assassin at the musicians, no threat she was steering him blind around. There was only a hall full of the people who had scorned them both, the wrong brother and the woman with no name, watching the 2 of them turn slow under 1,000 candles, chosen and choosing, entirely unhidden. Neither of them had ever been anyone's first choice. He had been the spare, she had been the shadow. The realm had wanted his brother, and her silence, and had gotten, instead, the 2 of them. It was, Vera thought, as he turned her to the left and she led him, far better than a first choice. It was a chosen one. Thank you for listening, and I hope you loved this one. Tell me honestly, was Emmerich right to try to set her free rather than let her fall beside him, or was he being far too noble for his own good, and would you have kept the oath as long as she did? Let me know down in the comments. I will see you very soon for another story.